Wonder what I should read today. Maybe just this book here. Let's see, what is this one? Oh no. Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. In 1973, Marvel published a classic Spider-Man story, the night Gwen Stacy died. It was an important event for the superhero Spider-Man in that he lost his first serious girlfriend to his archenemy, the Green Goblin. And it was a seminal moment in superhero comics in general. We'll be talking about that tonight, but we'll also be talking about a 2004 Spider-Man story that retroactively changed the meaning behind it, a story called Sins Past that says that Gwen Stacy was actually in a relationship with the Green Goblin. I will argue that it is a low point in the Spider-Man comics and an outlier for the otherwise high-quality writing by J. Michael Straczynski. We'll also take a look at the opinions of the creative team involved in this story in hindsight, as well as taking a look at the sales figures to see, was it really as bad as social media arguments, including mine, will have you believe. So without any further ado, let's talk about Sins Past. Gwen Stacy, the first serious girlfriend of Peter Parker. The character could match him intellectually and represented a sweet innocence, which meant it carried a lot of weight when she died. Spider-Man's enemy, Green Goblin, was really Norman Osborn, the wealthy industrialist and father of Peter's best friend, Harry. In issue 121, by writer Jerry Conway and artist Gil Kane, Norman has a psychotic break and recovers amnesiac memories that Spider-Man is Peter Parker and that he had taken the Goblin Serum. He becomes the Green Goblin again and kidnaps Gwen Stacy to force a showdown with Spider-Man. Green Goblin takes Gwen Stacy atop an iconic New York City bridge, but which bridge is it? Well, there's some debate there because the script calls it the George Washington Bridge, but artist Gil Kane clearly illustrated the Brooklyn Bridge. Now, does that actually affect anything that I'm going to talk about tonight? No, not at all. That's just a little bit of trivia. Quality trivia from a quality host. That's the Comic Tropes guarantee. Green Goblin throws Gwen Stacy from the top of the bridge. Spider-Man catches her, but her neck has been broken. She doesn't survive. Superheroes facing such a serious loss to an enemy and to lose supporting characters in general was not at all common throughout the Golden Age or the Silver Age of comics. And many comics historians point to this story as the beginning of the Bronze Age, a time when superhero comics were still the main dominant genre, but the storytelling grew up with its audience. And because it was such an important storyline for Spider-Man, there have been moments that revisit a girlfriend being thrown off of a bridge in both the comics and even the film adaptations. It's an iconic moment. Arguably Spider-Man's most iconic moment. And to Marvel's credit, they have not brought Gwen Stacy back from the dead. But they have given us clones and parallel dimension versions of the character. This story also featured the death of Green Goblin, who accidentally impaled himself on his own goblin glider. Writer Roger Stern introduced Hobgoblin, a new character who got access to Norman Osborn's Goblin Serum and equipment. Norman remained dead for over 20 years of published Spider-Man history, but in 1996, editor Bob Harris decided to bring the character back as the revealed bad guy behind their Clone Saga epic. A change to existing stories like that is what's known as a retcon, or retroactive continuity change. In this case, for instance, Green Goblin was revealed to have actually revived later from his impalement, and the Goblin Serum healed him. We were later told that, Norman Osborn healed, and he hung out in Europe, secretly planning his revenge against Spider-Man. At the time, that story wasn't super well accepted, But on the other hand, it gave about 30 years of Spider-Man stories where they have actively used Norman Osborn, Green Goblin. So you could argue it opened up storytelling possibilities. But this change to Gwen Stacy's past really didn't open up any other story possibilities. There was one very brief follow-up in the following year from Sin's Past. It's really not something that's ever been referred to again. I'm going to argue that the writer and editor of Amazing Spider-Man really did not create a change that justified such a big retcon. But let's start with talking about what was going on with the Spider-Man comics in 2004 when Sin's Past came out. The Spider-Man comics of the late 90s were a bit directionless. What had started out strong with artists like Todd McFarlane, Eric Larson, and Mark Bagley each growing the readership, the Spider-Man books had become rudderless during the 2-year-long Clone Saga, and they were having trouble getting their footing as the 90s drew to a close. With the first big-budget Spider-Man movie in development, Marvel knew they needed to put top talent behind their best-known character, and hired writer J. Michael Straczynski, previously best known for his work in television, from The Real Ghostbusters to Babylon 5. As well as artist John Romita Jr. In the first few months of their run, the duo had to deal with the ramifications of 9/11 in an issue that was very well regarded. Writer J. Michael Straczynski opted to focus on an aspect of Spider-Man that had rarely been addressed, the more supernatural side. He would go on to create or co-create characters like Ezekiel, Morlun, and introduce the concept of animalistic totems, which was his way of explaining why so many of Spider-Man's enemies happen to have an animal theme. There was some weird mystical stuff in some of those stories, like the time Spider-Man had his eye ripped out only to then shed his skin and reemerge healthy. But there was also a good mix of adventure and fun. The run was going very well for Marvel, who signed Straczynski to an exclusive, and he'd go on to have a 6-year-long run on Amazing Spider-Man. While your mileage may vary on how much you enjoyed this run, probably based on how much you enjoy the ongoing big bad of Morlun, an energy vampire that wants to feed on Spider-Man, I think you can argue that the run benefited from 3 things that really work well in Spider-Man comics: big adventure, melodrama with a vast supporting cast, and funny quips from Spider-Man himself. But then, right in the middle of the run, we get Sin's Past. Sin's Past is a 6-issue story beginning in issue 509 of Amazing Spider-Man from the summer of 2004. At home with his wife Mary Jane and Aunt May, Peter Parker receives a mysterious letter from the late Gwen Stacy, talking about missing him during her trip to Europe. There was a time where Gwen had in fact left for Europe and was away for several months in the comics. The letter makes Peter check on Gwen's grave, and then he broods, only to be attacked by 2 people decked out in all black. Peter doesn't want to reveal that he's Spider-Man, so he makes a super leap onto a passing truck, hoping that it was raining so hard that his attackers would not notice. Speaking of leaps, that's one heck of a leap in reasoning, Spidey. In the following issue, Peter looks more closely at the mail and sees photos taken with his wife and aunt and a letter telling him that they could be killed at any time. He opts to take the letter from Gwen to the police to have their forensics department analyze the imprints from a handwritten letter that was not included. Bizarrely, Spider-Man also threatens the detective that if he doesn't help, his family would be in danger from Spider-Man himself, which I personally found to be out of character. Regardless, the police give Peter their analysis, which shows Gwen wrote a letter that she was actually pregnant in Europe and gave birth to twins. Spidey also gets a note that his aunt has been abducted, but when he gets there, realizes at the last moment that it's a dummy with a bomb. He escapes just in time, and the mysterious attackers from earlier decide that it's not time to kill him for reasons that never become fully clear. In the 3rd issue, Peter makes the decision to go to Gwen's grave and get some of her DNA, which, gross. He analyzes it alongside the letter he had received and finds a genetic match to confirm that the letter was sent by her twin children. Then he's ambushed by one of the two attackers, unmasks her, and she looks just like Gwen Stacy. She is her daughter Sarah and has opted to get the same haircut and wear Gwen's iconic headband just so that there's no doubt.
No doubt.
Her brother is Gabriel, and clearly the two are adults, which doesn't really make sense since the comic's loose timeline should only account for about 5 or so years from when Gwen gave birth. Sarah escapes, and Gabriel says that Peter was their father. Their motivation is apparently revenge for abandoning them. At home, Mary Jane reveals she knows who the real father of Gwen Stacy's children is. Issue 512 is mostly told in flashbacks, and it retcons what we knew about Gwen. Mary Jane reveals she'd once overheard Gwen and Norman Osborn arguing about their kids, and Gwen explained to Mary Jane that while in Europe, she'd actually had a consensual affair with Norman. Sadly for us, that means we have to see Norman's craggly old face, which artist Mike Diodato clearly based on actor Tommy Lee Jones, as he has sex with Gwen. Peter reasons that Osborn's goblin serum-infused blood must have accelerated the twins' aging, and that Osborn turned them against Peter. It's a tough story beat to accept. The idea that Gwen Stacy specifically had sex with one of her friend's fathers? Yeah, I guess stuff like that can happen in real life, and that would be drama rife for storytelling potential. But from what we know about Gwen Stacy, who always seemed to be in love with Peter Parker, seemed to be loyal, okay, sure, Gwen Stacy never got developed the same way that, say, Mary Jane did, but it still seems like a wild swing. At the same time, if there was a storytelling payoff there, maybe I'd have gone with it. I just argue it really doesn't go anywhere that interesting at this point. The next 2 issues resolve the story. Peter holds a press conference telling his attackers to meet on the bridge where their mother died. Possibly a bit insensitive on his part, but sure. Spider-Man reveals Norman was their father and is manipulating them. Gabriel doesn't believe it, but Sarah argues with her brother that Peter could not have been their father because he would not have needed Gwen's DNA to test on if Peter was also their parent. Gabriel fights Spider-Man and accidentally shoots Sarah. This leads to her falling like Gwen, but this time, Peter saves her. However, that story beat had been recreated a lot, with writer Jerry Conway revisiting the fall just 6 months later in a scene where Spider-Man rescues Mary Jane after the Vulture drops her. It also would have still been fresh in readers' minds back then from the finale of the first live-action Spider-Man movie. I'd argue that revisiting that moment has lost a lot of impact over the years. Folks, I'm currently editing this episode, and it occurs to me that this moment is written as an homage, and it may have worked a little better if artist Mike Diodato Jr. decided to also homage Gil Kane's original page. While Sarah is taken to the hospital, Gabriel follows Norman's instructions, which lead him to a secret base with new goblin suits. In the final issue, while Spider-Man supplies Sarah with a blood transfusion, Gabriel takes the goblin serum and shows up as the Gray Goblin. He's dispatched very quickly, falling into the river and washing up ashore later with amnesia. One final last-minute edit, it occurs to me another thing that bothers me about this story is that while Gabriel and Sarah are physically adults, mentally, they're only about 5 years old. So this is a story of Peter Parker, Spider-Man, beating up some kids. It just doesn't sit well with me. And that is Sins Past in a nutshell. It's 20 years old, and it is memorable, but I'd argue not for the right reasons. I think that if you're going to do a retcon for a serialized ongoing superhero story, it really needs to be additive. And did this give us a new ongoing enemy that was interesting? No. Did it give us a new supporting character or change the dynamics of the supporting characters? No, not really. It changed how we thought about Gwen Stacy, but did it change how Spider-Man himself, the main character, operated? No. So, in my opinion, it was a miss. But, that's just my opinion. What did the creators themselves have to say after the story came out? Writer J. Michael Straczynski has spoken about how his original goal with the story was to have Peter be the father of the children. He put it in writing in a 2018 tweet, writing, quote, "Understand, that wasn't the original story. Peter was going to be the father of Gwen's kids. Marvel said, that ages Peter, so let's make it Norman instead. The fans will go nuts. I didn't quite realize what they meant when they said that." When Straczynski says Marvel, he's primarily referring to Marvel's then editor-in-chief, Joe Quesada. Quesada also addressed Sins Past in a comprehensive Spider-Man interview with Comic Book Resources in 2008. Among his comments, Quesada said, quote, "You're talking to a guy that feels a married Peter Parker isn't the healthiest thing for the franchise since it ages the character," referring to his infamous decision to have Marvel's devil, Mephisto, magically eliminate the Peter and MJ wedding in One More Day's storyline. Quesada had specific ideas about how to portray Peter Parker as young and thought that was important for readers. He addressed Sins Past, saying, quote, "In the end, it was mostly the idea of Peter having kids that I balked at." Quesada continued by saying, quote, "I offered up the option of having someone else be the father, perhaps Norman, and it was up to Joe as to whether he wanted to write that story or not." In other words, while Quesada offered some opinions, it was up to Straczynski to write Sins Past or not. For his part, artist Mike Deodato Jr. spoke with Andre Santana about his career with Spider-Man Crawlspace, and he said that he liked what he drew for the dramatic scenes, but admits he was never a big fan of Gwen Stacy and didn't care too much one way or the other about how the story handled the retcon. Back in 2004, as the Sins Past storyline wrapped up, writer J. Michael Straczynski spoke with Fanboy Planet and argued that the storyline was received just fine, and that it was just a few loud voices who didn't appreciate it. He told them, quote, "For good or bad, for the first time in a long time, people are talking about the title and arguing about it, and that's a positive thing." Is Straczynski correct? Is my opinion here that it wasn't a good story in the minority? There's two things I can look at to try to gauge that. Other reviews, as well as the sales on the title. Let's take a look at those. Comic Book Roundup aggregates critic scores similar to how Rotten Tomatoes does it for film. It's not quite scientific, but it's the best I can pull from. And if I use that, it looks like the first few chapters are accepted just fine, but issue 512 was the big reveal with Gwen Stacy sleeping with the Green Goblin. It has the most reviews and is the lowest rated issue. But let's look at sales. That's what the comic shops and readers thought about it. For that, I'm looking at issues 500 through 525 with the sales numbers gathered by Comicron.com. The anniversary issue of 500 is an obvious outlier. After that, we see a steady but really slight decline over 2 years, which is pretty normal. A new creative team or fresh start usually bumps the sales up, and it tends to trickle down a bit over time. And I don't think there's anything in the Sins Past period that shows any massive dips. It does decline after the story ends, but I can't argue that it's a statistically significant drop. So in the end, we're really left with, my opinion is one among many. But there are things I do like. I think that the artwork is actually very strong. It's a little strange how Mike Deodato Jr. really used real-world people like Robert Redford, Tommy Lee Jones, Robert De Niro as references for some of the characters in the books, but it works. The pacing is good, the dialogue is good, the action looks nice. There's a lot to like about that stuff. I just argue that the fundamental idea behind it is one I have a lot of trouble getting behind. It's a very, very serious issue, this idea of Gwen Stacy having an affair with an older man, cheating on Peter Parker. And, I think that that's just something that mainstream superheroes will always have a little bit of trouble with. I think that if you're going to tell such serious stories, they tend to work best as speculative fiction in comics. You could use superheroes, but it would probably be more in an original character scenario or at least a what-if type of book. superheroes are ultimately power fantasies. And we want to see our heroes be heroic and succeed. It's very tough to deal with depressing issues in comics. It's possible, but only to a certain extent. At the same time, sure, maybe I am in the minority, but I know that I'm not the only one that thought this way, because in 2021, writer Nick Spencer retconned the Retcon. I would not be able to argue that Nick Spencer's Retcon reads very well on its own, because it's very convoluted. But Legacy issue 874 of Amazing Spider-Man changes Sin's past. It reveals that Norman's son Harry, who also became a Green Goblin, used Mysterio's illusions and Mendel Strom's cloning tech to create Sarah and Gabriel, and simply hypnotized Norman and Gwen and Mary Jane into thinking that there had been an affair. It's convoluted, but honestly, I'll take it if it means I don't have to see that image of Norman's O-face and think of it as a real thing anymore. Yeah, anything that wipes that story out, personally, I'm more than okay with. That said, in general, I'm not a humongous fan of retcons. I would be curious, though, to hear if you, in the comments below, do have a retcon that you think worked very well, a retcon that you liked. And of course, I'd be curious to hear your opinions on this story itself. Before you leave, if you can hit like and subscribe, that sincerely helps the channel a lot. I'm always grateful. There's also a Patreon link in the description below, so maybe you'll consider that. That said, that's all I've got to say about Sin's past. Hopefully that's more than enough. I know other people have had their take on it, but it's a pretty wild story. It really changes a beloved character, and yeah, for like 20 years, people had that story, and I don't think it went over that well. But if you like J. Michael Straczynski, or you are curious, I do think that he has other things that work very well. I think he likes supernatural type stuff, and I think that that worked a lot better in his run on Thor. I think his run on Thor was very strong. He's got creator-owned comics, things like Rising Stars. I think that that's a strong point too. So I'll point you towards those. I wouldn't really recommend Sin's Past, but that's just me. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back real soon with another episode, and until then, keep reading comics. All right, thank you so much for watching this far. Thank you to my patrons. Thank you to my supporters on YouTube. I could not do this show without you guys. I'm always grateful and humbled at the support from this community. It really does mean a lot. We've got some interesting stuff coming up on this channel. I've got a lot of topic ideas. I need to do more on Wally Wood. I've got some manga history that I want to get into. A lot of top tier creators that I keep meaning to get to. Important people like Ramona Fraden and Mike Zeck. There's just so many ideas. And I know I've been going a little slow. I've just been battling depression, folks, and I'm sorry that that's a part of me, but you know, I'm handling it. I'm dealing with it. I take medication, I exercise, I'm trying to eat well, I keep busy with work, I socialize. These are all things that are good steps, and hopefully you guys out there are doing well. I know it's a tough time in a lot of ways for a lot of people. I also have a channel called Pros and Cons, where I do a weekly live stream for at least 2 hours, sometimes as many as 3 hours, talking about the comic books and comic book news that came out in the past week. Sometimes I include interviews. That channel, Pros and Cons, also has Trash Movie Bonanza, the movie review show I do with comic book artist Jim Mafood. So always appreciate it if you check that out, and keep an eye out, because this May, I believe I'm going to be able to participate with basically just about every comic book YouTuber. We're going to raise some money for charity in a Fortnite event. You'll be hearing more about that. Keep an eye on social media. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care. And because it was comics, let's see. I can't record if you keep meowing. Retroactively, at home with his wife Mary Jane and Aunt May, and sees photos that would have. The next 2 issues resolve this story. Peter holds a Thank you, Cat.